Let me tell you what Christmas looked like for most people in Victorian England. Not warm hearths, not plum pudding, not families gathered around a goose, raising glasses to absent friends. That Christmas, the Christmas you're imagining right now, didn't exist yet. It had to be invented. For most of England's poor, Christmas Day was just another day of survival. If you were lucky, you had work. Factories didn't close for holidays. The Industrial Revolution had no use for sentiment. You woke before dawn, walked through frozen streets to whatever mill or warehouse employed you, and worked until your body gave out. Then you went home to whatever cramped, unheated room you could afford, and you slept, and you did it again. If you were unlucky, if you'd lost your job, if you'd gotten sick, if you'd fallen into debt, you went to the workhouse. The workhouse was Victorian England's solution to poverty. Its logic was simple and brutal. Make relief so miserable that people would do anything to avoid needing it. If you were poor enough to require help, you surrendered everything. Your freedom, your dignity, your family. Husbands were separated from wives. Parents were separated from children. You wore a uniform. You ate gruel, deliberately inadequate, because the food had to be worse than whatever the lowest paid worker could afford. You worked. You stayed silent. You were punished for infractions. You lived in conditions designed to be degrading. And on Christmas Day, in the workhouse, nothing changed. No gifts, no feast, no family, just another bowl of thin porridge. Just another day of oakum picking or stone breaking. Just another reminder that you had failed, that you were a burden, that society wished you would simply disappear. This was the world that Charles Dickens wrote about. This was the world he was trying to change. You know Charles Dickens, or you think you do. You know him as the father of Christmas, the jolly Victorian gentleman who gave us Scrooge and Tiny Tim and God Bless Us, Everyone. You know him as the author of heartwarming redemption tales, stories where misers learn to love and orphans find families, and everything works out in the end. You've seen the adaptations, The Muppets, Patrick Stewart, Bill Murray. Every December, some version of A Christmas Carol appears on your screen, reminding you that people can change, that generosity matters, that the spirit of Christmas is real. We've turned Dickens into a greeting card, a Christmas ornament, a symbol of everything warm and good about the holiday season. But the man who created that warmth was forged in darkness. The real Charles Dickens was a 12-year-old boy sent to work in a bootblacking factory while his father rotted in debtor's prison. He was a husband who publicly humiliated his wife of 22 years to pursue an 18-year-old actress. He was a performer who became so obsessed with acting out a brutal murder scene that doctors begged him to stop, and who kept performing until it killed him. The man who invented the Christmas of generosity and family was cruel to his own family. The man who championed the poor kept a secret mistress in hidden houses. The man who wrote about redemption never quite achieved his own. Tonight, we're going to meet the real Charles Dickens. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these stories matter, the real stories, not the sanitized versions, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps these archives open. Every view, every subscription helps us dig deeper into the lives we think we know. Tonight, We'll trace Dickens from the blacking factory to Westminster Abbey. We'll watch him create the modern Christmas and destroy his marriage. We'll see him champion children in his fiction while neglecting his own. We'll follow him to the stage, where he performed murder night after night until his body couldn't take any more. We'll ask why we've turned this complicated, troubled, sometimes monstrous man into a symbol of holiday cheer. And we'll watch him die, still running from a childhood he could never escape. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand Charles Dickens, you have to understand his father. John Dickens was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, a respectable middle-class position that should have provided a comfortable life for his family. He was charming, sociable, eternally optimistic. People liked him. He told good stories. He was, by all accounts, a wonderful companion. He was also completely incapable of living within his means. John Dickens spent money he didn't have. He borrowed from friends, from colleagues, from anyone who would lend. He moved his family from house to house, always one step ahead of creditors. He saw no problem with this. Something would turn up. It always did. Until it didn't. Charles, the second of 8 children, grew up watching his father's cheerful irresponsibility. The moves, the whispered conversations about money, the visitors who came to the door with faces that made his mother cry. He learned early that the world was unstable, that comfort could vanish overnight, that the adults who were supposed to protect him couldn't even protect themselves. Years later, Dickens would immortalize his father as Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, the lovable optimist, always waiting for something to turn up, always somehow surviving despite total financial incompetence. In fiction, Micawber is charming. In reality, John Dickens was a disaster, and in February 1824, the disaster finally arrived. John Dickens was arrested for debt. The amount was £40, roughly 6 months' salary. He couldn't pay it. He couldn't borrow any more. The creditors had run out of patience. He was taken to Marshalsea Prison. Debtors' prisons were a peculiar feature of English law. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you were imprisoned until you did pay. The obvious problem, that you couldn't earn money to pay debts while sitting in prison, was simply ignored. People stayed for years, some stayed for life, some died there, their debts unpaid, their families destroyed. Marshalsea was in Southwark, south of the Thames. It was old, crumbling, overcrowded. Inmates who had money could buy better accommodations, food, even alcohol. Those who had nothing slept in communal wards and survived on charity. John Dickens had nothing. Charles, 12 years old, walked across London to visit his father. He found a broken man. The cheerful optimist had finally run out of road. John Dickens wept and told his son that the sun had set on him forever, but the worst was yet to come. In debtors' prison, families had a choice. They could stay outside, trying to earn money to pay off the debt, or they could move into the prison with the debtor, sharing his confinement. Elizabeth Dickens chose to join her husband. She took the younger children with her into Marshalsea. The family would stay together, even if together meant prison. But Charles was 12, old enough to work, old enough to contribute. There wasn't room for him in Marshalsea. And besides, he could be useful outside. A family friend, James Lamert, had recently invested in a boot blacking business. Warren's Blacking manufactured polish for boots and shoes, sold in small pots with labels pasted on by hand. Lamert offered Charles a job. The pay was 6 shillings a week. The hours were 10 per day, 6 days a week. The work was mindless, repetitive, endless. Paste labels on pots, stack the pots, paste more labels. Charles Dickens, who had been raised to think of himself as a gentleman's son, who had been promised an education and a future, was sent to work in a factory. He was 12 years old. The factory was at Hungerford Stairs, near the Thames. It was a rotting, rat-infested building that seemed ready to collapse into the river. The work floor was damp and dark. The other workers were boys from the streets, uneducated, rough, with no expectations of anything better. Charles pasted labels, hour after hour, day after day, the same motion repeated thousands of times, the smell of blacking, the scratch of rats in the walls, the crude jokes of the other boys, who saw immediately that this new worker was different, softer, not one of them. He learned to fit in. He learned to laugh at the jokes and work alongside the others and pretend that this was normal. But inside, something was breaking. The shame was overwhelming. He had been promised a different life. His parents had talked about education, about prospects, about the future that awaited a clever boy from a respectable family. Now he stood in a factory window. The workspace was visible from the street, pasting labels on pots while passers-by watched. Anyone could see him. Anyone could know what he had become. Years later, when he was the most famous writer in England, Dickens would walk miles out of his way to avoid passing the site where the factory had stood. The building was long gone, but the shame remained. The wound never healed. Dickens almost never spoke of the blacking factory. He kept it secret from everyone, his wife, his children, his readers. Only once, late in life, did he tell the full story to his closest friend, John Forster, and even then, he couldn't get through it without tears. "No words can express the secret agony of my soul," he wrote, describing those months. "I felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast." He was there for perhaps 4 months, maybe 6. The records are unclear, and Dickens himself couldn't bear to be precise. His father eventually got out of prison through a small inheritance, and shortly afterward, Charles was withdrawn from the factory. But his mother wanted him to go back. Elizabeth Dickens argued that the family needed the money. Charles was earning 6 shillings a week, not nothing to a family that had just emerged from debtor's prison. Why shouldn't he continue? John Dickens, for once, overruled her. Charles would return to school. He would have his future back. Dickens never forgave his mother. Decades later, when she was old and ill, he remained cold to her. She had been willing to sacrifice him. She had chosen poverty's convenience over her son's soul. "I never afterwards forgot," he wrote. "I never shall forget. I never can forget." The blacking factory gave Dickens something, even as it took so much away. It gave him the poor. Before Warren's, Charles Dickens had been a middle-class child with middle-class expectations. He knew poverty existed. You couldn't live in England and not know. But it was abstract, distant, someone else's problem. After Warren's, he knew what it felt like. He had stood alongside boys who would never escape, who would work in factories until they died, who'd been written off by a society that considered them disposable. He had been one of them, if only for a few months. He had tasted the despair, and he had seen how easy it was to fall. His family had been respectable one day and ruined the next. The distance between comfort and catastrophe was smaller than anyone wanted to admit. It could happen to anyone. Every novel Dickens ever wrote is haunted by this knowledge. The orphans, the street children, the families destroyed by debt and circumstance. They're not abstractions to him. They're the boys he worked beside, They're the future he almost had. The blacking factory made Dickens a witness, and witnesses have an obligation to testify. In 1834, the British government decided to solve the problem of poverty. Their solution was the Poor Law Amendment Act, a piece of legislation so cruel, so deliberately punitive, that it shaped English society for generations. Its architect, Edwin Chadwick, believed that poverty was primarily a moral failing. The poor were poor because they were lazy. If you made relief unpleasant enough, they would choose to work instead. The old system of outdoor relief, giving money or food to poor people in their own homes, was largely abolished. If you needed help, you went to the workhouse, and the workhouse was designed to be miserable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't incompetence or underfunding. The misery was the point. The principle was called less eligibility. Conditions in the workhouse had to be worse than conditions outside, or people might prefer the workhouse to work. So the food was inadequate. The work was pointless and degrading. Families were separated. Discipline was harsh. Every aspect of workhouse life was calibrated to make you desperate to leave, or desperate enough never to enter in the first place. The poor who had no choice, the elderly, the disabled, the orphaned children, suffered accordingly. If you entered a Victorian workhouse, here is what you would experience. First, separation. Men went to the men's ward, women to the women's ward. Children over 7 were taken from their parents entirely. Husbands and wives who had been married for decades might never see each other again, except during supervised visits. Then, the uniform. Your own clothes were taken away. You were dressed in workhouse garb, rough, ugly, identical to everyone else. You were no longer an individual, you were an inmate. Then, the work, oakum picking, unraveling old ropes until your fingers bled, stone breaking, smashing rocks into gravel, bone grinding, crushing bones into fertilizer. The work served no real economic purpose. It existed to teach you that idleness would not be tolerated. Then, the silence. Talking was often forbidden, except at designated times. You ate in silence. You worked in silence. You existed in silence. And through all of it, the food, the infamous workhouse diet, gruel for breakfast, bread and cheese for dinner, gruel again for supper. Portions were measured precisely, just enough to prevent starvation, never enough to provide comfort. People died in workhouses, the elderly, the sick, the children, especially the children. The death rates were appalling, but that was considered acceptable. The system was working as designed. The smallest victims of the poor law were the children. Workhouse children were separated from their parents at age 7, sometimes younger. They lived in dormitories, worked alongside adults, received minimal education. Many were apprenticed to factory owners or tradesmen at young ages, essentially sold into labor that was often brutal. Chimney sweeps recruited from workhouses. The boys, some as young as 4, were small enough to climb inside chimneys, scraping away soot until their elbows and knees were raw and bleeding. Many suffocated. Many developed cancer from the soot. Many simply disappeared, and no one asked questions. Factory owners took workhouse children as cheap labor. The hours were long, the machinery was dangerous, and if a child lost a finger or an arm or a life, there were always more children available. This was legal, this was normal. This was how Victorian England dealt with its poor. And into this world, in 1837, Charles Dickens dropped a bomb. "Please, sir, I want some more." It's the most famous line Dickens ever wrote. A workhouse boy, starving on his carefully calculated portion of gruel, dares to ask for a second helping. The response is outrage. The boy is beaten, imprisoned, offered for sale to anyone who will take him. Oliver Twist was not subtle. Dickens wasn't interested in subtlety. He wanted his readers to see what the poor law was actually doing to actual children. He wanted comfortable, middle-class families, reading the novel in monthly installments, to confront the system their taxes were funding. Mr. Bumble, the cruel beadle who treats Oliver as property. The workhouse board, calculating exactly how little food they can provide. The coffin maker who takes Oliver as an apprentice and works him like a slave. The thieves who exploit him. The murderer who kills the woman who tried to help him. The novel is a catalogue of cruelty, and every cruelty in it was real. Dickens wasn't inventing horrors, he was documenting them. The book was a sensation. Readers wept. Reformers cited it. The phrase, "the parish boy's progress," the novel's subtitle, became shorthand for everything wrong with how England treated its poor. But here's the thing about Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist ends happily. The orphan boy, after all his suffering, discovers that he's not really a workhouse child at all. His father was a wealthy man. His mother was a gentleman's daughter. Oliver has an inheritance waiting for him, a family eager to claim him, a future of comfort and respectability. He was never really one of those poor children. He just looked like one for a while. This is Dickens's compromise, and it runs through almost everything he wrote. He exposes injustice brilliantly. He makes you see the suffering, feel the cruelty, understand the system's evil. But then he rescues his protagonists through individual luck rather than systemic change. Oliver escapes the workhouse not because the workhouse is reformed, but because he turns out to be secretly middle class. The system continues. Other children remain trapped, but our hero gets out, and we can close the book feeling satisfied. Dickens wanted reform, not revolution. He wanted the wealthy to be kinder, not the system to be dismantled. He wanted Christmas generosity, the rich choosing to help the poor, not structural change that would make poverty less likely in the first place. This tension defines his work. He shows us the horror with one hand and offers us a comfortable exit with the other. We can weep for Oliver and still believe that individual goodness is enough to fix things. It isn't, but believing it is feels much better than facing the alternative. Before we go further, we need to understand what Christmas was and wasn't before Dickens transformed it. The holiday we know today, the family gatherings, the gift exchanges, the emphasis on generosity and warmth, didn't exist in the early 19th century. Christmas was fading. In some places, it had almost disappeared. The Puritans had suppressed Christmas celebrations in the 17th century, banning the holiday entirely for a time. The Industrial Revolution further eroded traditional observances. Factories didn't close for religious festivals, and workers who had moved from villages to cities lost the community traditions that had sustained the holiday. By the 1820s and 1830s, Christmas was an afterthought for many English families. A day off work, perhaps, if you were lucky. Church in the morning. A slightly better dinner than usual, if you could afford it. But nothing like the elaborate celebration we now consider traditional. There was no standard Christmas dinner. Turkey wasn't yet the default. Goose was more common for those who could afford anything at all. Christmas trees were virtually unknown in England. That tradition would arrive with Prince Albert later in the century. Christmas cards hadn't been invented, Santa Claus, as we know him, didn't exist. Christmas was a minor holiday, overshadowed by Easter and various saints' days. It was dying. And then Charles Dickens decided to save it. October 1843. Dickens was in trouble. He was already famous, wildly famous, the most popular novelist in England. The Pickwick Papers had made him a celebrity at 24. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and The Old Curiosity Shop had cemented his reputation. He was lionized, celebrated, mobbed by admirers wherever he went. But fame doesn't pay bills, and Dickens had a lot of bills. His most recent novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, was selling poorly. His publishers were unhappy. His contracts were unfavorable. He'd signed them when he was young and desperate, and now they constrained how much he could earn from his own success. Meanwhile, expenses mounted. He had a wife. He had children, many children, with more on the way. He had a large house to maintain. He had his lifestyle to fund because Charles Dickens had inherited his father's inability to live modestly. And speaking of his father, John Dickens kept getting into debt, kept expecting his famous son to bail him out, kept being a drain on resources that were already stretched too thin. Dickens needed money. He needed a hit. He needed something that would sell quickly, in time for Christmas. He decided to write a ghost story. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in a fever. 6 weeks. That's all it took. He started in mid-October and finished in late November, working around his other commitments, often writing late into the night after long walks through London streets. The story came to him whole. Scrooge, the miser, Marley's ghost, wrapped in chains, the three spirits, past, present, and yet to come, Tiny Tim and his crutch, the transformation on Christmas morning. He wept while writing certain scenes. He laughed aloud at others. He walked 15 or 20 miles through London at night when he couldn't sleep, working out dialogue in his head, seeing the characters as clearly as the people he passed. I was very much affected by the little book myself, he wrote to a friend. In various ways, he insisted on controlling every aspect of production. The book would have a special binding, red cloth with gold lettering. It would have hand-colored illustrations. It would have gilt edges. It would be beautiful, the kind of book you would want to give as a gift. All of this cost money. Dickens didn't care. This book would be different. This book mattered. A Christmas Carol is not just a story about Christmas. Read it again. Really read it. Not the Muppet version or the Bill Murray version or whatever adaptation you half remember. Read what Dickens actually wrote. The first spirit shows Scrooge his past. The lonely boy left at school over Christmas, while other children went home. The young man who chose money over love. The gradual hardening of a heart that was once capable of joy. The second spirit shows Scrooge the present, the Cratchit family, desperately poor but full of love. Tiny Tim, sick and likely to die. The miners and lighthouse keepers and sailors celebrating Christmas in harsh conditions. The children, ignorance and want, hidden beneath the spirit's robe. Allegorical figures representing the consequences of society's neglect. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom. The third spirit shows Scrooge the future, his own death, unmourned, his possessions stolen by scavengers, Tiny Tim's empty chair, the consequences of a life lived without love or generosity, and threaded through all of it, the workhouse. Are there no prisons? Scrooge asks when approached to donate to the poor. And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? He's not being callous, he's being practical. Victorian England had systems for dealing with poverty, the prisons, the workhouses. Let the poor go there. The spirits show him what those answers really mean. They show him Tiny Tim, who will die because his father can't afford doctors. They show him ignorance and want, the products of a society that throws its poor into institutions and calls the problem solved. Scrooge's sin isn't just personal miserliness, it's systemic complacency. He's comfortable because he's convinced himself that someone else is handling the problem. A Christmas Carol is an attack on the poor law dressed up as a ghost story. But the genius of the carol, and perhaps its limitation, is the ending. Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning a changed man. He buys the biggest turkey in the shop. He gives money to the poor. He raises Bob Cratchit's salary. He becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. The miser becomes generous. The cold heart learns to love. The transformation is complete, and it happens in a single night through the intervention of supernatural forces. This is what Dickens offered his readers. The fantasy that hearts can change, that the rich can choose to be kind, that the solution to poverty is moral transformation. Individual wealthy people deciding to care rather than structural reform that might threaten their wealth. It's a beautiful fantasy. It's also, in some ways, a dangerous one, because hearts don't usually change. The Scrooges of the world don't wake up on Christmas morning suddenly generous. The systems that create poverty don't disappear because one rich man decides to buy a turkey. Dickens knew this. His other novels are full of unredeemed villains, of systems that grind on regardless of individual kindness, of children who don't get rescued by convenient inheritances. But in A Christmas Carol, he gave us the happy ending we wanted. He let us believe that goodness could win through generosity alone. We're still believing it. Every Christmas, we watch Scrooge transform, and we feel good about humanity, and we go back to our lives without changing the systems that create poverty in the first place. Dickens invented that Christmas. We've been celebrating it ever since. A Christmas Carol was published on December 19th, 1843. It sold out its first printing of 6,000 copies by Christmas Eve. A second printing sold out almost immediately. By the end of the year, it was the most talked about book in England. The response was overwhelming. People wept. People wrote to Dickens telling him the book had changed their lives. One factory owner supposedly gave his workers an extra day off after reading it. The book became an instant tradition, the first of the Christmas traditions Dickens would help create. But there was a problem. Dickens had insisted on the expensive production, the gilt edges, the colored illustrations, the fine binding. He had set the price at 5 shillings, lower than his publishers wanted, because he wanted the book to be accessible. The combination of high costs and low price meant that despite the enormous sales, the profits were tiny. Dickens made only £230 from the first edition, a fraction of what he'd hoped. And then the pirates arrived. Within weeks, unauthorized adaptations appeared, stage versions, cheap reprints, knockoffs of every kind. Dickens sued and won, but the legal costs consumed whatever money he'd recovered. The book that defined generosity left its author feeling cheated. A Christmas Carol made Dickens immortal. It also made him very little money, a bitter irony he never forgot. Dickens didn't stop with the carol. Over the next few years, he wrote more Christmas books: The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, The Haunted Man. None achieved the success of the original, but together they established Dickens as the voice of Christmas. More importantly, the carol's influence spread beyond the book itself. The emphasis on family gatherings, the idea that Christmas should be a time of generosity to the poor, the notion that even the hardest heart can be transformed by the spirit of the season, the specific iconography, the goose, the pudding, the decorations, the sense of warmth against winter cold. Dickens didn't invent all of this, but he crystallized it. He gave it narrative form. He made it feel timeless, even though much of it was brand new. When we celebrate Christmas today, when we gather with family, when we donate to charity, when we feel vaguely guilty about the homeless and hungry, we're celebrating the holiday Dickens invented. The irony is thick. The man who created this vision of warmth and generosity would, in his own life, prove incapable of either. But that part of the story was still to come. Charles Dickens married Catherine Hogarth in 1836. He was 24, she was 21. He was already becoming famous. The Pickwick Papers was being published in monthly installments, and each new chapter increased his celebrity. She was the daughter of his editor, pleasant and pretty, the kind of wife a rising young writer was supposed to have. By all accounts, they were happy at first. Catherine was gentle, agreeable, eager to please. Charles was energetic, ambitious, full of plans. They set up house together and started a family. The children came quickly. Charlie in 1837, Mary in 1838, Kate in 1839, Walter in 1841, Francis in 1844, Alfred in 1845, Sidney in 1847, Henry in 1849, Dora in 1850, she died in infancy, Edward in 1852, 10 children in 16 years, plus several miscarriages. Catherine was perpetually pregnant, perpetually recovering from pregnancy, perpetually exhausted. She struggled with what we would now recognize as postpartum depression. She gained weight. She moved slowly. She couldn't keep up with her husband's restless energy. And Charles began to resent her for it. Before the resentment, though, came the complications. When Charles and Catherine married, her younger sister Mary came to live with them. Mary was 16, pretty, charming. Everything Catherine was becoming less of as the pregnancies accumulated. Charles adored her. How much he adored her is impossible to say. There's no evidence of a physical affair, but the emotional attachment was intense and deeply strange. In May 1837, Mary died suddenly, probably of heart failure. She was 17 years old. She collapsed in Charles's arms after a night at the theatre. Dickens was devastated. He couldn't write for months. He kept a lock of her hair for the rest of his life. He wore her ring and asked to be buried wearing it. He idealized her in his fiction. The pure young women who die tragically in his novels are all, in some sense, Mary Hogarth. I solemnly believe that so perfect a creature never breathed, he wrote. This was his wife's sister. Catherine had to watch her husband grieve for Mary with an intensity he would never show for her. And then another sister moved in. Georgina Hogarth came to help with the household when she was 15, and Catherine was overwhelmed with children. She stayed for the rest of Dickens's life. She ran the house. She managed the servants. She traveled with the family. She was, in many ways, more of a partner to Charles than Catherine ever was. Again, there's no evidence of a physical affair, but the emotional intimacy was clear to everyone. When the marriage finally collapsed, Georgina stayed with Charles, not with her own sister. She chose him. The triangle, the exhausted wife, the youthful sister, the demanding husband, defined the Dickens household for years. Catherine watched her sisters take the roles she was too tired to fill. Charles compared his wife unfavorably to the idealized Mary and the useful Georgina. The marriage was dying slowly, but it took another woman to kill it. In 1857, Charles Dickens met Ellen Ternan. She was 18 years old. He was 45. She was an actress in a play Dickens was producing, one of many theatrical projects he threw himself into as his restlessness increased. She was pretty, intelligent, cultured, everything he had decided Catherine wasn't. We don't know exactly when the affair began. We don't know the precise nature of their relationship in the early years. Dickens was careful. Ellen was careful. The evidence is fragmentary. What we know is that something changed in 1857. Something broke in the marriage that couldn't be repaired. Charles began sleeping in a separate bedroom. He had a door installed between his dressing room and Catherine's bedroom, and then had it sealed shut. He complained to friends about his wife's inadequacies. He claimed she had never loved their children. He claimed she was mentally unstable. He was preparing the ground for what came next. In May 1858, Charles Dickens published a statement in his own magazine, Household Words. It was unprecedented. The most famous writer in England was publicly addressing his marriage, something that simply wasn't done. The statement denied rumours of an affair while simultaneously attacking Catherine's fitness as a wife and mother. Some domestic trouble of mine, of long standing, on which I will make no further remark than that it claims to be respected as being of a sacredly private nature, has lately been made the occasion of misrepresentations, most grossly false, most monstrous, and most cruel. The misrepresentations he was denying were, of course, true. He was involved with Ellen Ternan. The denials were lies, but it got worse. Another document circulated, a letter Dickens had written to his manager, which was accidentally published in newspapers. This letter attacked Catherine directly. She does not, and she never did, care for the children, and the children do not, and they never did care for her. 22 years of marriage, 10 children, and her husband was publicly claiming she had never loved any of them. Dickens demanded that his friends choose sides. Those who remained loyal to Catherine were cut off. Mark Lemon, his longtime friend and collaborator, sided with Catherine and was never spoken to again. Even his own publishers faced his wrath. When Punch magazine didn't denounce the rumours quickly enough, Dickens ended his relationship with them. Catherine was given a house and an income. She was allowed to see her children, though most of them stayed with their father. She was, essentially, erased from his life. The eldest son, Charlie, chose to live with his mother. Dickens never forgave him. The others stayed with their father and with Aunt Georgina, who ran the household, who made everything work, who had chosen Charles over her own sister. Catherine lived for another 20 years, largely alone, largely forgotten. She saved every letter Charles had ever written her. She gave them to her daughter Kate with instructions. Give these to the British Museum, that the world may know he loved me once. He had. Once. Before the children and the exhaustion and the younger sisters and Ellen Ternan. Before he decided that his wife was an obstacle to his happiness rather than a partner in it. The man who wrote about the redemptive power of love and family destroyed his own family without a second thought. Dickens kept Ellen Ternan hidden for the rest of his life. He bought her houses, first one, then another when the neighbours asked too many questions. He visited her secretly. When he travelled, She sometimes accompanied him under assumed names. He supported her financially, paid for her education, shaped her life according to his needs. There may have been a child. Some evidence suggests Ellen gave birth to a baby who died in infancy, probably in France, where such things could be more easily hidden. The evidence is disputed. We'll probably never know for certain. What we know is that Dickens spent his last 13 years in a secret relationship with a woman he couldn't acknowledge. The apostle of domestic warmth lived a double life. The champion of hearth and home had destroyed one family and hidden another. Ellen survived him by many years. She eventually married a clergyman and lived a respectable life, never publicly discussing her relationship with Dickens. She burned most of her papers before she died. The secret remained a secret, or at least a rumor never quite confirmed, for decades. Only in the 20th century did scholars piece together the full story, and even now, gaps remain. Dickens took the truth to his grave. Perhaps that's what he wanted. Perhaps the man who had created so many stories couldn't bear for this one to be told. Charles Dickens could not be still. He walked, obsessively, compulsively, for hours at a time. 20 miles through London streets was routine, sometimes 30. He walked at night when he couldn't sleep, which was often. He walked in rain and cold and fog, past the very neighborhoods he wrote about, through slums and across bridges and along the river. He rearranged furniture, constantly. Visitors to his homes noted that nothing was ever in the same place twice. He moved beds and desks and chairs, always adjusting, always dissatisfied. He insisted that beds be oriented north-south, believing it improved his sleep. It didn't. He took on projects, editing magazines, producing plays, giving speeches, organizing charitable events. He worked constantly, driven by something that wouldn't let him rest. "I am incapable of rest," he wrote to a friend. "I am quite confident I should rust, break, and die if I spared myself. Much better to die doing." He was running from something. The blacking factory, the shame, the wound that had never healed. He had built an entire life trying to prove that he wasn't that 12-year-old boy pasting labels in a warehouse. But you can't outrun your own history. And by his 50s, the darkness was catching up. In 1853, Dickens began giving public readings of his work. This was unprecedented for an author of his stature. Writers wrote. They didn't perform. But Dickens had always loved theatre. He'd nearly become an actor before his writing career took off, and the readings satisfied something in him that writing alone couldn't provide. The first readings were for charity, then they became commercial. Dickens would stand on stage with his book, a specially printed edition with large type, and read. But read doesn't capture what he did. He performed. He did all the voices. He moved around the stage, gesturing, grimacing, becoming each character in turn. He made audiences laugh at Mr. Pickwick and weep for Tiny Tim. He held thousands of people in his hand, controlling their emotions with his voice alone. The audiences were enormous. The money was excellent, and Dickens was immediately, hopelessly addicted. The readings gave him something no amount of writing could provide: immediate response. When you write a novel, you work alone for months or years. Then the book is published, and you wait for reviews, for sales figures, for letters from readers. The feedback is delayed and filtered. You never see your audience. On stage, Dickens could watch his audience laugh and cry. He could feel their attention, their love, their need for him. He could adjust his performance in real time, pushing harder when they responded, pulling back when they didn't. It was a drug, and like all drugs, it required increasing doses. The tours grew longer, the schedule grew more demanding. His managers worried about his health. His doctors warned him to slow down. He ignored everyone. "The readings kill me," he admitted, and then he scheduled more of them. As Dickens aged, his novels grew darker. The early books, Pickwick, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, are ultimately optimistic. Good triumphs, villains are defeated, orphans find families. The tone is comic even when the subject matter is serious. The later books are different. Bleak House, 1853, centers on a lawsuit that consumes everyone it touches, destroying lives for generations. One character spontaneously combusts. Dickens insisted this was scientifically possible, as if the corruption of the legal system has become literally toxic. Little Dorrit, 1857, is set partly in the Marshalsea, his father's prison, finally confronted directly. The book is suffused with imprisonment, literal prisons, financial prisons, social prisons, the prisons we build for ourselves. Great Expectations, 1861, follows a young man who escapes poverty only to discover that his rise was funded by a convict's money. The original ending was happy. Dickens changed it to something more ambiguous, more honest, more painful. Our Mutual Friend, 1865, opens with a corpse fisher pulling bodies from the Thames and selling whatever he finds in their pockets. The novel is full of garbage heaps, drowned men, false identities, lives built on death. The warmth was giving way to something else. The older Dickens got, the less he believed in the easy redemptions he'd once offered. On June 9th, 1865, Charles Dickens was involved in a train crash. He was returning from France with Ellen Ternan, secretly, of course, always secretly, when the train derailed at a bridge under repair. Several carriages plunged into the riverbed below. 10 people died. 40 were injured. Dickens's carriage was one of the few that didn't fall. It hung suspended over the gap, tilting at a terrifying angle. Dickens climbed out, helped rescue other passengers, tended to the dying with brandy from his flask. He was a hero. He was also traumatized. The accident haunted him for the rest of his life. He became nervous on trains, couldn't travel without feeling the phantom sensation of the carriage tilting beneath him. He had what we would now recognize as PTSD, flashbacks and anxiety attacks that grew worse rather than better. And something else happened in that dangling carriage. He suddenly remembered that the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend, the novel he was currently writing, was still on board. He climbed back into the tilting carriage to retrieve it, risking his life for pages of fiction. The accident happened on June 9th. He would die exactly 5 years later, on June 9th, 1870. Coincidence probably, but Dickens noticed patterns, and this one seemed to mean something. In 1868, Dickens added something new to his reading repertoire. He had been performing publicly for 15 years by then. He'd read The Christmas Carol hundreds of times. He'd done scenes from Pickwick, from Dombey and Son, from David Copperfield. The audiences loved him. The money poured in, but he wanted something more. He chose The Murder of Nancy from Oliver Twist. If you know the novel, you know the scene. Nancy, the prostitute with a heart of gold, has been secretly meeting with the people trying to help Oliver. Her lover, Bill Sikes, a brutal criminal, discovers her betrayal. In a rage, he beats her to death. It's the most violent scene Dickens ever wrote. And now, He wanted to perform it live. The murder plays out in terrible detail. Sykes confronts Nancy. She begs for mercy. She offers to go away, to leave London forever, to do anything he asks. He doesn't listen. "Bill, Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood." He seizes a heavy club. He strikes her across the face, knocking her down. She holds up a white handkerchief, the one she was given by Rose Maylie, the symbol of her attempt to do good, and prays. Then, with one last prayer for mercy to her Maker, she reeled and staggered back, and with her eyes still raised towards heaven, sank down on her knees. He strikes again and again, until she stops moving, until the handkerchief is soaked with blood, until Nancy, the only character in Oliver Twist, who genuinely helps the orphan, the only criminal who shows a conscience, is dead. Dickens wanted to perform this. He wanted to become Sykes. He wanted to stand on stage and beat a woman to death in front of paying audiences. He practiced obsessively. He had a special stage built. He worked on the voices, Nancy's pleading, Sykes's rage, until they were perfect. He choreographed every movement, every gesture, every moment of the killing. His friends who attended rehearsals were disturbed. The performance was too real, too intense, too violent. One said he had an almost irresistible impulse to scream while watching. Dickens's son Charlie watched a rehearsal and told his father it was the finest thing I have ever heard, but I am bound to tell you that I had an irresistible impulse upon me to scream. These weren't idle observations, these were warnings. Something was wrong with this performance. Something was dangerous about a 60-year-old man pouring this much energy into simulated murder. Dickens didn't care. He had to do it. The first public performance of Sykes and Nancy was in January 1869. The effect was overwhelming. Women fainted. Men went pale. The audience watched the beloved author transform into a killer. Watched him beat an invisible woman to death. Watched him pour rage and violence into every word. The intensity was unbearable. There was a fixed expression of horror on all the faces, one observer wrote. The audience was frozen with terror. When it was over, Dickens was drenched in sweat, his pulse racing, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. The performance had taken everything out of him. He was satisfied. He scheduled more performances. The murder became his obsession. He performed it over and over, sometimes several times a week. Each time he poured himself completely into the violence. Each time he left the stage exhausted, depleted, somehow emptied. His manager, George Dolby, grew increasingly worried. The readings were taking a physical toll that couldn't be ignored. Dickens's pulse would spike to dangerous levels during the murder scene. He had trouble speaking clearly afterward. His left side was growing weak. Doctors examined him and were alarmed. They diagnosed irritability of the heart, what we might now recognize as signs of cardiovascular disease, possibly compounded by small strokes. They told him the readings were killing him. He kept going. "I must do it," he said. "Murder, I must do it, murder." Why? Why this scene? Why this obsession? What drove a 60-year-old man to perform simulated violence night after night until his body failed? Perhaps it was the addiction to audience response. The murder got the biggest reaction of anything in his repertoire. If he needed applause like a drug, this was the strongest dose. Perhaps it was artistic ambition. He wanted to prove he could do something no other author had done. Make audiences experience violence with the same intensity as if it were real. Perhaps it was something darker. Perhaps the murder let him access rage he usually had to suppress. Perhaps there was violence inside Charles Dickens, toward his wife, toward his father, toward himself, that only the stage could safely release. Or perhaps the boy from the blacking factory was still trying to prove something, still trying to feel something, still running from the shame and finding that no amount of success, no amount of performance, no amount of applause could ever fill the void. We'll never know for certain. Dickens didn't explain. He just kept performing the murder until it killed him. In April 1869, Dickens collapsed. He had been giving readings in Scotland when his health finally failed. He couldn't walk properly. His speech was slurred. His left foot dragged when he moved. His doctors examined him and delivered an ultimatum: stop the readings or die. Dickens had 25 more performances scheduled. He agreed to cancel them. Then he negotiated. He would give 12 final readings. Just 12. And then stop forever. The doctors reluctantly agreed. The farewell tour was scheduled for the following year. It would culminate in a final performance at St. James's Hall in London, and the murder would be included. The final readings began in January 1870. Dickens was visibly unwell. He had trouble with his left foot. He mispronounced words, saying Pickwick when he meant Picksniff, confusing names and places. The stroke damage was evident to anyone paying attention. But the audiences came. They came in enormous numbers, knowing these would be their last chances to see the great man perform. They watched him struggle through the readings and loved him anyway. The murder remained on the program. Dickens couldn't give it up. Even now, even dying, he needed to do it one more time. On March 8, 1870, he performed Sikes and Nancy for the last time. The audience was as horrified as ever. Dickens was as exhausted as ever. But when it was done, it was done. He would never perform the murder again. He had given everything to it. Now, there was nothing left to give. The final public reading. St. James's Hall, London. 2,000 people packed the auditorium to see Charles Dickens one last time. They had paid premium prices. They had waited in long lines. They understood they were witnessing the end of something. Dickens was 58 years old and looked older. His face was drawn. His left hand hung uselessly at his side. He walked slowly to the stage, and the audience rose to give him a standing ovation before he'd said a word. He didn't do the murder that night. He'd promised his doctors. Instead, he gave them lighter material, the Christmas Carol, of course, and the trial scene from Pickwick. He gave them laughter rather than horror. The audience loved it. They laughed at the right moments and wept at the right moments and applauded with a desperation that suggested they knew what was ending. When the reading was finished, Dickens stood at the front of the stage. Tears were streaming down his face. The audience had risen again, applauding, refusing to stop. He raised his hand for silence, and slowly the hall grew quiet. "From these garish lights," he said, "I vanish now forevermore, with a heartfelt, grateful, respectful, and affectionate farewell." He kissed his hand to them. He walked off stage. He never performed publicly again. 15 years of readings, hundreds of performances, millions of people who had watched him bring his characters to life. It was over. He had less than 3 months to live. Dickens spent his final months at Gad's Hill Place, his country home in Kent. He was working on a new novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a murder mystery he would never finish. The book is dark, strange, unlike anything he'd written before. A young man disappears. His uncle, a cathedral choirmaster who leads a secret opium-addicted life, is suspected. We'll never know how it was supposed to end. Dickens died with the mystery unsolved. He also made preparations. He simplified his will. He burned papers, letters, manuscripts, documents he didn't want surviving him. He was putting his affairs in order. On June 8, 1870, he spent the day writing. He had dinner with Georgina, still running his household, still loyal after all these years. During the meal, he complained of feeling unwell. Then his face changed. "Come and lie down," Georgina said. "Yes, on the ground," he answered. His last coherent words. He collapsed. He never regained consciousness. Charles Dickens died on the evening of June 9, 1870. He was 58 years old. The cause was a stroke, the culmination of years of overwork, of stress, of physical deterioration that everyone had warned him about, and he had refused to heed. His will was specific. He wanted, emphatically, to be buried in an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner. He wanted no public announcement until the funeral was over. He wanted no memorial. The country ignored his wishes. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, in Poets' Corner, alongside Chaucer and Spenser. The funeral was technically private. Only 12 people attended, but thousands lined up afterward to file past the grave. They kept coming for days. The grave couldn't be closed because of the crowds. The newspapers printed endless tributes. The Queen sent condolences. The nation mourned. The man who had wanted a simple burial became, in death, exactly what he had been in life, a public spectacle. Notice who wasn't at the funeral. Ellen Ternan, the woman he had loved, or at least kept, for 13 years. She couldn't be there. The secret had to be maintained, even now. She mourned alone, wherever she was, unable to claim any public role in his death. Catherine Dickens, his wife of 22 years, mother of his 10 children, whom he had publicly humiliated and privately abandoned. She wasn't invited. Or if she was, she didn't come. Most of his children were there, but the family was fractured, scattered, shaped by their father's decisions in ways they were still trying to understand. He had loved them, probably. He had also neglected them, controlled them, expected them to live up to standards he constantly changed. The man who wrote about the redemptive power of family left his own family in pieces. The man who invented Christmas generosity died keeping secrets from everyone who loved him. The man who championed the poor and the orphaned and the lost had been lost himself all along, since a warehouse on the Thames when he was 12 years old. Charles Dickens was one of the most successful writers who ever lived. He was rich. He was famous. He was adored by millions. He shaped the English language, the celebration of Christmas, the novel as a form. His characters, Scrooge, Oliver, Pip, David Copperfield, are still alive in our collective imagination more than 150 years after his death. And he never got over being a 12-year-old boy in a bootblacking factory, 4 months, maybe 6, a fragment of a childhood. But it broke something in him that never healed: the walking, the restlessness, the inability to be satisfied, the cruelty toward his wife, the secret life, the obsessive performing, the murder he couldn't stop enacting. All of it traces back to Warren's blacking, to the shame of pasting labels while pedestrians watched, to the terror of discovering how easily a respectable family could fall. He spent 50 years running from that warehouse. He never escaped. We've turned Dickens into exactly what he would have hated: a comfortable figure, a symbol of holiday cheer, a name attached to theme park villages and Victorian Christmas experiences. A face on greeting cards. The jovial genius who gave us heartwarming stories and taught us to be generous. We've forgotten the darkness. We've forgotten the blacking factory and the debtors' prison. We've forgotten the workhouse children and the chimney sweeps. We've forgotten the rage that drove him to perform murder until his body failed. We've kept the sentiment and lost the outrage. We've kept Tiny Tim and forgotten the system that would have let him die. We've made Dickens safe, and safe was the one thing he never was. The real Charles Dickens was a traumatized child who became a complicated man. He exposed injustice and abandoned his wife. He championed the poor and kept a secret mistress. He loved his children and neglected them. He preached forgiveness and held grudges until death. He wrote the most searing indictments of Victorian cruelty while benefiting from Victorian prosperity. He created Scrooge's transformation while proving incapable of transforming himself. He invented a Christmas of generosity and family while destroying his own family and hoarding his secrets. He contained multitudes, and most of them were at war with each other. This doesn't make him less worthy of our attention. It makes him more interesting, more human, more like the rest of us, capable of great good and great harm, often simultaneously, rarely understanding our own motivations. Why do we need Dickens to be a saint? Perhaps for the same reason we need Anastasia to have survived, and Jack Frost to be playful, and every dark story to have a warm ending. We can't bear complexity. We can't sit with a man who was both victim and perpetrator, reformer and hypocrite, genius and monster. But that's who he was. That's who most people are. The blacking factory made Dickens a witness to suffering. His talent made him able to communicate what he'd witnessed. His trauma made him unable to stop. He wrote about redemption because he needed to believe it was possible. He wrote about family because his own was broken. He wrote about childhood because his had been stolen. And he performed murder night after night because something inside him needed to destroy as much as it needed to create. Dickens left us the Workhouse and the Christmas Carol, Oliver's hunger and Scrooge's transformation, the cruelty of Fagin and the sweetness of Tiny Tim, the horror of Victorian poverty and the fantasy that individual kindness could solve it. He left us a way of seeing, a lens through which the comfortable could glimpse the suffering they usually ignored. He made the middle class weep for the poor, even if he couldn't make them change the systems that created poverty. He left us Christmas. Not the whole holiday, but the shape of it, the emphasis on family, generosity, redemption. Every December, when we gather with loved ones and feel vaguely guilty about those who have less, we're celebrating the holiday Dickens invented. And he left us the question that haunts all his work. Why do we let children suffer? Why do we build systems that grind up the vulnerable? Why, when we know what's happening, do we convince ourselves it's someone else's problem? He never answered those questions. Neither have we. Charles Dickens walked the streets of London every night, trying to escape something that lived inside him. He turned that darkness into some of the greatest novels ever written. He also turned it on his family, his health, and ultimately himself. The Christmas we celebrate is his invention. So is the guilt we feel when we ignore the poor. He gave us both, the warmth and the conscience, the sentiment and the horror underneath. He wanted us to see what he had seen, the workhouse, the factory, the children who never got out. He wanted us to feel something, to do something, to change something. We felt, We rarely did. We almost never changed. And maybe that's the real legacy of Charles Dickens. Not the cozy Christmas specials, not the heartwarming adaptations, but the uncomfortable truth he spent his life trying to tell us, that we live in systems that devour the weak, and that all our sentiment about family and generosity means nothing if we don't actually change anything. The boy in the blacking factory became the most famous writer in the world. He never stopped being the boy in the blacking factory. Until next time.